Thanks for joining us in what is now part 4 of our COVID-19 vaccine series of webinars. We're going to be talking today about some topics that are on the minds of many of the employers we work with. And I have a couple of my esteemed partners with me here today, Rebecca Strauss and Tim Gutwald. Together, the three of us are going to hit on some topics, including whether to mandate the vaccine or adopt a voluntary vaccination policy in your workplace, incentives to encourage your employees to get vaccinated if you don't mandate it, some considerations surrounding liability, whether you mandate or whether you make it a voluntary vaccination policy, immunity that's available to employers. We want to keep that in mind as we start having our workplaces become more vaccinated. We need to keep in mind the rules that continue to apply and the immunity that is available if you enforce those rules. And then lastly, we'll also touch on record keeping concerns, confidentiality concerns, and whether there is any HIPAA requirements that you need to think about as you retain certain records regarding the vaccine and COVID-19 tests of your employees. All right, so Rebecca, I'm going to hand the microphone to you to get started on the first question that's on everyone's mind, mandating the vaccine or not.
Thank you, Amy. I'm glad to be here with you and with everyone on the call this morning. Of the 4 topics we're covering this morning that Amy just mentioned, this one is a bit of a review, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Our partner, Sarah Willie, did a truly excellent webinar on this topic in December. That was, if you're looking through our recorded webinars on our website, that would be the vaccine webinar number 2 in the series, and you can get a full hour of information on this question that was on everyone's mind at the time: can we mandate the vaccine? So I'm going to review this for you, and then we're going to move on to kind of the hot topics of today, which are incentives to encourage vaccination and liability and immunity issues, as well as HIPAA issues. So those are the questions that we're getting fast and furious here at Miller Johnson. But now for a review for you, can we mandate the vaccine? First, a few definitions, or at least one. Who is we? Can we mandate the vaccine? We are talking about employers. We are talking about whether employers can require employees to get the COVID vaccine to keep their employment. There is no discussion here this morning, frankly, nor will there ever be, about employers literally requiring individuals to get a shot in their arm, or they'll pay some sort of other consequences. Employers just control the employment relationship. That is all we are talking about. Can employers say that to work here, you need to get the COVID vaccine? The answer is, subject to a few exceptions that we will discuss, yes. Generally speaking, yes. Keep in mind that this is not a new concept under the law, and it's certainly not a new concept for the employment lawyers here at Miller Johnson. And that is because the flu vaccine, which has been around obviously for much longer than the COVID vaccine, the flu vaccine has been mandated by employers over the years in hospitals and nursing home settings. So for healthcare provider employers, the concept of requiring their employees to receive a vaccine to be able to come to work is not a new concept. And it has been tested and it has survived legal challenge. Now, there are some differences with the COVID vaccine from the flu vaccine. There may be some creative arguments out there, but the general consensus at this point is that employers can require the vaccine in order for employees to come to work. Again, subject to some caveats that we are going to discuss in the liability section, right? You're going to, spoiler alert, and you probably remember this from Sarah's webinar if you attended that, but if you are going to mandate it, there must be exceptions for disabilities, right? People for health reasons who cannot get the vaccine. There must be exceptions for religious objections, which are can be quite broad, okay? And there are issues about if you are administering the vaccine yourself and therefore asking health-related questions that are necessary before you can administer the vaccine to a person, whether those are disability-related inquiries as defined by the ADA, and therefore whether you need a business necessity before you can do that. So we will get to that in the third section of this presentation, but just again, in very general terms, can employers have mandatory vaccine programs? The answer is yes. Remember that this is probably way down the road just because of vaccine supplies right now. In Tim and Amy's webinar yesterday, which I did not present in, but I attended and thoroughly enjoyed, they talked about how the distribution of the vaccine is picking up, maybe not as fast as a lot of us would like, but it is starting to roll, but it's not, it's going to be a long time before everyone and anyone has access to the vaccine, and unless you're an essential employer like a hospital, whether it's going to be a little while before you are even going to have the option to mandate the vaccine. Also, one other note, a lot of our clients or just webinar attendees like to know what everyone else is doing, right? And so our very unofficial poll, which is just us talking to clients and community members, is that right now we are not finding employers mandating the vaccine, even in the healthcare industry. So as you are talking to the leaders in your organizations and that concept comes up, you should keep that in mind, that we are not aware of employers who are leaning towards a mandatory vaccination rule. That may change as supplies become more plentiful. That probably won't happen towards the end of this year or early 2021, in my opinion, before we get to that point. But that's the status as we sit here today. Okay, let's talk about, again, the real hot topics that we have been getting calls on recently and that we've been seeing in the news. The first is lawful incentives to encourage vaccination. Okay, so these, again, folks that aren't mandating either because of supply issues or just as a policy, they don't want to require their employees to have it, but they would like as many employees to get it as possible. So they are offering incentives. These are the sorts of incentives we've been seeing and you may have heard of. Some employers are giving away extra PTO to employees who receive the COVID vaccine. They're giving gift cards, bonuses, straight up cash, right? Always popular, those sorts of things. So what do you need to be aware of? My colleague Trip Vanderwall is a benefits lawyer here and works on wellness plans. And on behalf of Trip, we'd like to remind all of you about the ADA and wellness plan. So if you offer an incentive or a reward for employees that receive the COVID vaccine, that would most likely be considered a type of wellness plan, right? Just like we offer financial incentives to employees who stop smoking, for instance, right? We offer incentives for employees to do things that are for their own benefit health-wise. That's the concept of the wellness plan. Wellness plans almost always, always include the exchange of health-related information, disability-related information, right? So how does that fit in with the ADA's rule that employers can't make disability-related inquiries unless there's a business necessity? Well, the ADA, the EEOC has said that wellness plans are permissible under the ADA as long as they're truly voluntary, right? As long as, if the wellness plan is truly voluntary, and let's say me, Rebecca, signs up for it without any undue pressure or coercion, and then I share disability-related information with whomever is running the wellness plan, that's not a requirement of my employment. That's not the employer demanding that I share that information with them because I voluntarily signed up for the wellness plan, okay? Hope you're following. This is a problem of a webinar. I can't see your heads nodding, but hopefully you're nodding along right now. So the issue is whether, with wellness plans, the issue always comes down to whether it is truly voluntary. Until recently, there has been a 30% rule. The 30% rule is you look at the total cost of your health care plan to the employee on an individual basis. And if your incentive to the employee is less than 30% of that total cost, the wellness plan will be deemed voluntary. If the incentive is more than that 30%, then the EEOC, the courts may say it's not voluntary. Now, that rule was recently withdrawn, and that 30% rule is currently, frankly, just up in the air. No one knows what will happen under the new administration. So don't hold on too close and tight to that 30% number. And if you're at 29%, don't assume you're fine. But it's still a good general rule of thumb. So the only employers on the call that need to really be thinking about this wellness plan issue are those that already offer wellness plans and various incentives as part of those wellness plans. And if you are generous with that and are getting, somewhere close to the 30% mark, before offering an incentive for the COVID vaccine, you probably want to pick up the phone and talk to us about the risks of doing that. Okay, the next bullet point is somewhat related, and that is, beware of generosity, too much generosity becoming coercive. You'll see in our later slides when we're talking about liability and also ADA issues, there is a distinction between mandatory programs and voluntary programs. So be careful if you are putting together a voluntary program, but the incentives are so strong it starts looking like a mandatory program or coercive, then you may be unintentionally creating a mandatory program, and then you're going to have to pay attention to the liability issues and risk issues that Amy and I are going to talk about with mandatory programs. What is so generous that it becomes coercive? None of this has been tested yet, so I can't tell you specifically outside of the wellness plan program. But we can imagine, for instance, maybe you can't use PTO, right, if you didn't get the vaccine, but you get extra PTO if you do get the vaccine. That sort of thing might be deemed coercive. Financial incentives that are so generous, right, it is would be very hard for an employee to say no. I'm not talking about a few $100s. I'm talking about much more of that. Focus on the carrots and not on the sticks, right, when offering incentives, and just make sure they're reasonable so that it doesn't look like you're starting to coerce people, so that a reasonable person couldn't really say no because it is so generous. And again, as you're thinking about these things and considering incentives, please feel free to let us know if you have questions and balancing the risks in terms of the specific program you are considering. Now, for those of you who knew me before COVID-19, you know that I did a lot of Fair Labor Standards Act work, and I still do. So those issues are always on my mind. So on the right side of the slide, what do we do with these incentives in terms of overtime and pay and all of that sort of thing? First of all, do you need to you, as an incentive, you may want to pay for the hours that employees go to get the vaccine. Note that if the program is truly voluntary, we do not think you have to pay for the time that an employee gets the vaccine, okay? If it's truly voluntary. But you might want to. That's another type of incentive, right? We may want to give everyone pay for the time it takes, especially if it's off-site, to go get the vaccine. And we may want to give them paid time if they have any symptoms that make them feel unwell after the vaccine, right? There's reports, not everyone feels unwell, but some people, right, the immunity system kicks in and causes the types of symptoms that tell us our immunity system is working, like fevers and fatigue and things like that. So you may want to pay for that time off as an incentive, okay? If you are doing cash incentives, right, gift cards or bonuses, do those have to be included in the overtime rate? Probably. We're hoping that the Department of Labor will give some advice on that. And as a policy, from a policy perspective, my guess is they would not want it to be included because they would like employers to offer financial incentives, and every time you have to include it in the overtime rate, that's a disincentive. However, the way the law and the regulations read right now, yes, cash bonuses for getting the vaccine, assuming that you announce the bonus ahead of time, would be a non-discretionary bonus. Non-discretionary bonus, you do this, we'll do that. That's exactly what this would be, and therefore it would be included in the overtime rate. Okay, now let's turn back to Amy, and let's talk about, I'm probably going to join her for some of this too, truth be told, but let's talk about liability and immunity issues if you either mandate or offer the vaccine. We've been getting lots and lots of questions about these issues.
Thanks, Rebecca. And yes, I'm going to rope you into this discussion, even if you didn't want to be, because you are one of our authorities on this. And I meant to say this at the outset, so I'll say it now that we've got most of our participants on the line. As with so many things going on with the pandemic and COVID-19 vaccine developments, the law here is changing, and so our guidance will change over time too. So what we're telling you today on January 27th is what we know and can provide based on the law, the rules, the guidance as they exist today. So as this continues to be a moving target, please reach out to us if you have any questions that might require a little bit of an update based on what we know 2 weeks down the road or a month down the road. Okay, so let's start our liability discussion on the mandatory vaccine policy front. We have employers who are concerned about, in either context, if it's a mandatory policy that you're applying or a voluntary vaccination policy, concerns about employees who might suffer a negative reaction to the vaccine. And also employers who are just wondering what are the other potential exposure to liability. So if you mandate the vaccine, what we do know is that, let's say your employee suffers a negative reaction. It's a work-related injury, and so a workers' compensation policy is going to cover those claims. In the flu vaccine clinic context, there have been cases through the years where occasionally an employee suffers a negative reaction to the flu vaccine and has a workers' comp claim. So that should put some of your minds at ease that we don't want there to be any negative reactions, obviously, but if there were one, you're probably covered on your workers' comp. Another area to consider when you're thinking about potential liability and you're mandating the vaccine are just the responsibilities under the law, federal and state, that you have to follow when you decide to mandate the vaccine. And Sarah Willie's previous webinars on this topic have been excellent. And so we do recommend referring back to those. But Rebecca, could you give us just a quick summary on what our employers need to consider if they decide at some point down the road to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Amy, thank you. So one of the potential liability issues for employers who mandate is a claim that the employer has violated Title VII for religious objections or the ADA for disability-related issues. There must be an exception to any mandatory program. First of all, let's just cover ADA. For individuals who have health-related reasons covered under the ADA, such that they cannot receive the vaccine. We have on our resource center, first of all, this will be coming up in the slide too, but we have policies, mandatory and voluntary vaccine policies for your consideration. And we also have a form you can use that employees can fill out to request an exception. You must allow that. Under religious objections, you must also allow that. Keep in mind that religious objections, religion is defined very, very broadly under the law. In fact, you can be the only person who has the belief system that you profess to have. It doesn't have to be an organized religion. There's no minimum member requirement, that sort of thing. And so those folks also have to be allowed an exemption. Now, what happens for the folks that ask for those exemptions? In mandatory flu times, they would be required, you'd be required to offer reasonable accommodation, right? Just like any ADA issue. And the reasonable accommodation often was wearing a face mask whenever at work. At the time, people really didn't like that. Now, of course, we're used to seeing people at work in face masks. So just continuing using face masks and PPE may be a reasonable accommodation. If the person can work at home, that is a reasonable accommodation. If you find there is no reasonable accommodation possible, the EEOC has said in a recent Q&A that you can prohibit them from working, but the EEOC cautions against terminating the employee's employment, right? So that is the type of situation that we would have to work with you on a case-by-case basis, right, to go through that reasonable accommodation process. And then if you conclude none is available, what to do with the employment status of that individual. Okay. Now let's think about ADA liability for disability-related inquiries, right? So those of you that live in this world day in and day out know that employers can't ask disability-related inquiries of employees unless there's a business necessity. The EEOC has said that just administering the vaccine is not a disability-related inquiry. Okay, so that does not fall under this restriction under the ADA. However, before you get the vaccine, before a person receives the vaccine, the individual administering the vaccine does go through a list of questions, right, to make sure it's safe to get the vaccine, for you to get the vaccine. Those questions might be disability-related inquiries, okay? So the shot itself is not, but the questions that come along with it may be. And so if you are administering the vaccine yourself with your own employees, or remember agents, right? You hire someone to do it on your behalf, those may be disability-related inquiries asked by the employer. So then we flip to, well, when can we make disability-related inquiries? And you have to have a business necessity, right? An important business reason. So then start asking yourself, What is my business reason for requiring the vaccine, right? How would I articulate it? By the way, hopefully you've done this already when thinking about whether you want to have a mandatory policy in the first place. If you haven't, you should, right? Why do we want to make this mandatory? Is it to protect patients, for instance, in a hospital setting? That's a pretty good argument, right? What are some other possible arguments? Attendance, right? COVID is causing attendance issues and is preventing us from meeting our customer needs. Could that be business necessity? That hasn't been tested yet. And just to be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that. I could argue that both ways. As things stand right now, none of the rules about when employees shouldn't come to work, none of them are modified if an employee has the vaccine. Now that could change, right? Laws could change, standards could change, health orders could change. But as it stands right now, even if I have the vaccine, the law requires if I come into close contact with a positive COVID-19 case, I still have to stay home. Okay, so as things stand right now, it's unclear to me whether vaccines are important for improving attendance. It could be, right, because I'm less likely to get sick with COVID-19 after I get the vaccine. So perhaps my chance of getting COVID-19 would decrease, meaning the chance of me being absent also decreases. So there are certainly arguments to be made, but these are the sorts of things you need to think about if you are considering a mandatory vaccine program. And as one colleague said to a legal journal publication a few weeks ago, the way this has played out, all of these considerations, basically the slide, has encouraged employers to have voluntary programs instead of mandatory, but also the rules seem to provide an incentive for employers to send their employees to the employee's own healthcare professionals or an independent pharmacy or something like that for the vaccine instead of administering it themselves, right? Even if you have a mandatory policy, but you say you're responsible for going to get it yourself, right? We don't care where you get it or who you get it from. Just by X date, pick a date, bring back proof that you have received the vaccine, then you are not making a disability-related inquiry, and you don't have to go through kind of the mental gymnastics that we just started going down. Again, it will be a while before most employees who don't fall into some special category are able to do that. One last note on this, and then I promise I'll stop talking and get it back to Amy. The EEOC has said asking for proof of vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. So that example I just gave you, right, just telling employees we don't care where you get it, just make sure you get it by such and such a date and bring us proof that you got it, that is not a disability-related inquiry, and you can do that without going through the business necessity analysis. Okay, I'm in charge of the slides, so I'm going to change the slides and send things back over to Amy to talk about voluntary risks of liability with voluntary vaccination programs. Amy?
Great, thanks, Rebecca. So now we're in the realm of what probably is going to be the case for many of our employers. They're likely, at least as of now, while supply of the vaccine is low, adopting a voluntary policy. So questions are still coming up. What sort of liability do we have to be foreseeing and minimizing if possible? I think at the outset, it's worth just noting that when you have a voluntary vaccination policy, it's hard to imagine scenarios where the employer is going to be on the hook for some injury caused to the employee, simply because a negligence claim in this circumstance is going to be hard. And so we're assuming, right, that we're not in the workers' comp world. and if you're thinking through the negligence assessment, the employer needs to have a duty to the employee that's been violated. And there needs to be a causation element too. So the injury to the employee needs to be tied to the decision made by the employer. Right now, employers may adopt voluntary vaccination policies, and in almost every case, as Rebecca said, we're not aware of a client we've worked with so far who's done anything different. These voluntary policies are being adopted. So that makes it hard to say that the employer owes some duty to the employee that is breached when the employee perhaps suffers a negative reaction to the vaccine. That said, there are circumstances you can think about. They're not happening right now, but let's imagine you've got, months down the road, you're setting up a clinic in your workplace to make it easier for employees to get the vaccine. And we know the COVID vaccine is not your easiest vaccine to work with. It requires storage in pretty cold temperatures, not the sort of temperatures that our typical office freezers can guarantee. And so there may be situations where, something is done wrong in the administration of the vaccine. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but that's likely, a problem caused by the third party administering the vaccine and not the employer. So there, the cause of the injury to the employee is not really tied to the employer. There's a superseding cause that injures that employee, negligence on the part of the third party administering it. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, a couple of bullets down. But I just want to note at the outset, duty will be a difficult element to prove. Causation may be a difficult element to prove. If we're in the voluntary vaccination policy world and you're not, your employees have some injury and workers' comp does not cover it, then it's probably the case that the general commercial liability policy that you have will cover any injury caused to the employee. That's because those policies, generally speaking, cover bodily injuries caused by an accident. So I think that it's another good moment to feel that your mind is put a little bit at ease, that you have some protection already in place through the insurance that you purchased for workers' comp and your general commercial liability policy. One topic that's coming up in the dialogue that's going on among practitioners across the country as they're thinking through this liability inquiry is the PrEP Act. The PrEP Act provides immunity in some circumstances, and Tim Gutwald's on the line, and he can talk a little bit about this, and I'm hoping he'll jump in with me here. The PrEP Act is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, and it provides immunity to traditionally healthcare providers and other entities in that sector that are providing medical countermeasures, which include vaccines against COVID-19. There is some discussion that the PrEP Act may be evolving in a way that provides immunity even to a private employer, not in the healthcare sector, that provides facilities for the administration of the vaccine. So brings in that third party to actually vaccinate its employees. There may be a source of immunity there, but it's not entirely clear from the advisory opinions that have been issued more recently. And I think we don't have a solid answer on that yet, but we do have some room to think that this could be an area that evolves in a way that eventually provides private employers even one more possible way to sort of sleep easier on this topic, a potential immunity there. Tim, do you have anything to add on this PrEP Act immunity question?
Yeah, I mean, mostly just echoing what you said with respect to, uncertainty in this area. this is not really, there's not a lot of case law with respect to this kind of idea. I think the primary question, well, one thing you mentioned countermeasures, and the vaccine, among other things, is clearly a countermeasure for COVID-19. So that's not an issue. You know, if your employees are getting the vaccine, then that's going to be administering a countermeasure. So that's not the issue. The question becomes, you know, it's qualified individuals and whether or not an employer meets that. If you look at the definition of that within the statute, you know, it talks about manufacturers, distributors, and, you know, it talks more about clinical personnel, but there are program planners. And there's an argument that if you're coordinating with, say, the public health department or some other private healthcare entity, you know, local health system or hospital, that you might be able to argue that you're, you know, part of a program planners. I think the other option here, you know, with, in addition to PrEP Act immunity, is there are a number of provisions providing immunity here in Michigan law, you know, for people that are volunteering, for who aren't getting paid, for, you know, public health departments and their authorized agents and representatives. So I think one thing to consider when you're thinking about hosting a clinic, you know, at your location, your office, your warehouse, wherever, is to maybe enter into some sort of memorandum of understanding with the local health department. That'll give you, I think, an argument under state law as well, and that might also help you under the PrEP Act immunity. So again, there's some uncertainty here, but I think as we move forward, I think we'll get a better idea of ways that you can strengthen your argument that you'd be entitled to those immunity provisions.
That's helpful, Tim. And I think what we can tell our listeners today is we are continuing to monitor the PrEP Act and, as Tim was mentioning, all of these sources of immunity under state law. A lot of this is several months down the road at this point, because we're not in a position to even have, you know, for our private non-healthcare employers, vaccine clinics on site right now. That's just not, it's not even a possibility at the moment. So a lot of this is us foreseeing, you know, risks and strategies for the future. And we'll keep monitoring that and provide updates when we can.
I will just add that I'll get into a little bit more detail on the PrEP Act tomorrow for our webinar that's really targeted to healthcare employers, since, you know, they're the ones that are administering the vaccine. It's really pertinent to them. So there'll be some more detail there. If you either want to join tomorrow, that's fine, or you'll be able to have access to that webinar, you know, after the fact, and you could sort of fast forward to that section. So just another thing to keep in mind.
Excellent. And one other thing to consider as you're considering potential sources of liability in this area is that you've maybe had a flu clinic on site at your workplace in the past. What sort of contract did you enter into to have that clinic take place and have a third party come in and actually vaccinate your employees? It's possible that contract provided you protection, indemnified you if the third party made some mistake. And that sort of inquiry will be worth doing when we get to a point where we have employers who are considering opening up COVID-19 clinics in their workplace to facilitate vaccination of their employees. Final point on this is we've got some questions about waivers. Should we have our employees sign a waiver when we are adopting a voluntary policy and want to minimize the risk of some liability? I think the waiver it's an option in this circumstance, because if you're not in the mandatory realm, you're not dealing with workers' compensation, you can have your employees sign a waiver. As you all likely know from listening to previous webinars, waivers aren't enforceable in the workers' comp setting. But it's worth considering whether that's really going to help achieve your goal of encouraging vaccination or not. And Rebecca, I'd love to call on you for this, because I think when we've talked about this in the past, you've had some good good insight on whether a waiver is really going to be productive toward your goal or perhaps counterproductive.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. This goes back to a question we got quite a bit when workplaces started opening back up, at least in a limited way after the pretty strict shutdown. And we got a number of questions saying, asking us, should we have employees sign a waiver when they come back for in-person work, saying that if they get sick from COVID-19 because they picked it up at work, they will not hold us responsible. Again, that's really a client-by-client discussion to have, but general guidelines to keep in mind is if they did pick it up at work, it would be covered by workers' comp, and you can't waive a workers' comp claim preemptively. So the waiver would not have been effective anyway. But then in that context, we also talked about the psychology of it, right? What message does that send to employees? The message it sends is there is danger that you will catch COVID-19 at work, right? So with that in mind, let's think about the waiver for negative effects of the COVID-19 vaccine. Asking employees to sign a waiver for any harm that may come to them because they got the vaccine certainly sends a message to them that there is the possibility, right, of them experiencing harm because they got the vaccine. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, as we've mentioned a few times, that if you make the vaccine mandatory, it will almost certainly, any damages would almost certainly be covered under workers' comp anyway, and you can't waive a workers' comp claim, and so a waiver would be ineffective. For voluntary programs, if you are sending people out, again, just asking them to get the vaccine wherever they can, however they wish, there's really no need for a waiver. If you are providing a clinic on site and want employees to sign a waiver on their way through the clinic, there's nothing prohibiting you from doing that, but just keep in mind, right, the message you are sending to employees, and also keep in mind, as Amy mentioned, that your general commercial liability insurance will probably cover any claims anyway. So in balancing the risk benefit, those are the sorts of things to keep in mind. All of you have specific situations though, so if you are seriously considering waivers, please contact any of us on the webinar or any Miller Johnson lawyer, and we can talk you through that.
And Rebecca, I'll make a quick plug here before we move on that we've got, through the really great work of our employment section, we've got great ready-made policies in place on our resource center for employers who are mandating the vaccine or making it voluntary. And those policies will assist you in making sure you're complying with the laws and the guidance that we know of right now. One last point on liability and immunity. This is an important point because I think we are already probably seeing this, not seeing this, but imagining the scenario in which this could happen. As your workplace starts to become full of workers who are getting vaccinated, there's naturally going to be this tendency to probably by your employees to relax a little bit in their protections that they are used to doing right now every day, wearing the mask, socially distancing. Those rules continue to apply even after your employees get vaccinated. There is no exception right now in MIOSHA's emergency rules, in the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services epidemic orders, no exception for vaccinated employees or vaccinated people. So even after you get the vaccine, it continues to be the law that you need to wear a mask in public gatherings. Socially distancing is still part of the rules that we need to follow. And so, so make sure that that message is also coming clear to your employees, that after they're vaccinated, the rules that your workplace has put into place continue to apply. one reason why this is important is because right now, under Michigan law that was enacted last year, employers and businesses have immunity from liability when they're acting in compliance with all of the COVID-19 rules, regulations, and orders that are in effect at the time of some alleged risk that causes harm. Now, this is a concern not for your employees, because when your employees are harmed, we're back in that workers' compensation scenario. But consider the fact that your workplace may have invitees who come on the property, vendors and suppliers perhaps, or customers. You could have a business that's really public facing, and so you interact with and your employees interact with lots of people who are not your employees. The immunity that Michigan law provides in the scenario where you are following all the COVID-19 rules, enforcing them in your workplace, those are important protections for businesses, and you want to maintain those protections, put yourself in a position where you can claim that immunity. And so I just wanted to remind our employers, as their employees get vaccinated, to keep enforcing those rules, those COVID-19 safety precautions that we're all used to following right now. Because so long as you do that, you continue to keep yourself in a position to claim immunity if we're in an unfortunate scenario where someone, like a member of the public or a vendor, is injured. And then that disclaimer again, that this is all subject to change. At the moment, there is no exception in the COVID-19 rules for vaccinated employees or vaccinated people, but we might see that. We could see the Department of Health and Human Services, or MIOSHA, relax some of those rules for vaccinated employees. It's possible, it just hasn't happened yet. And so while your employees start to become vaccinated, keep following the COVID-19 rules.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. Let's answer some questions now that we got that came in prior to the webinar. And I know there's been lots of questions coming in during the webinar. Let's take a few of those too. Then we'll get to Tim on confidentiality issues with COVID vaccination. And then we'll take more questions until we come upon 9 o'clock. So here are some of the questions that came in prior to the webinar. Some of them, by the way, if you don't see your questions up here, it means we think we already answered it during the presentation. Okay, one question we received, what if employees harass other employees for not getting the vaccine? Should the employer stay neutral, or should the employer do something? I'll take this one because this is really an employment-related question. I would suggest you treat this just like any other harassment issue, right? And employees should not be harassing each other based on their decision to get the vaccine or not, just like employees should not be harassing each other really for just about anything, right, that interferes with the employee's ability to do their job. They're there to work. They're not there for their coworkers' judgments or interference in their work based on a personal choice the employee made. Okay, so most of your policies, at least the ones that we have worked on, prohibit harassment not just for unlawful harassment, but for harassment for just about anything. Could this harassment involve unlawful harassment? Sure, I can certainly imagine situations where that would be the case, right? If someone didn't get the vaccine for a health-related reason, their doctor recommended they not get the vaccine. There are plenty of people in that category, right, whose doctors recommend they don't get the vaccine, and then they start getting harassed or bullied by a coworker for that. That could be an ADA issue, for instance, right? That's not too hard of a stretch to get there. So yes, employees should not be harassing each other, and you should step in and handle it like any other harassment issue. Okay. Amy, what do you think about the second bullet point? Can employers suggest that employees get the vaccine?
Yeah, so we've talked about encouraging the vaccine and the ways that you can do that through incentives and also educational components, letting your employees know that you're staying on top of the vaccine news and you're distributing that to your employees with the hope that eventually they can go get the vaccine. Where I think this question gets a little bit tricky is if your employees fall into one of the many categories of people who right now can't get the vaccine because they're simply not eligible yet. So it's worth considering for your workplace that you can start that educational campaign now. You can make the very helpful and informative information available to your employees about the vaccine. But when it comes to actually encouraging employees to get it, just keep in mind that we are very early in the phased rollout of the vaccine, and there are going to be categories of employees who are not, who do not fall into, for example, that category we talked about in our webinar yesterday, the essential workers or the critical infrastructure workers. Those folks are in some way probably going to be prioritized in the phased rollout. But there are many, many employers and employees who don't fall into those sectors. And so your employees may not be in a position to get the vaccine for some time. And I think that message needs to be a part of whatever discussion you have with your workforce as you talk about vaccination and the ways in which it will help the employees and your business continue to do well in 2021.
Perfect. What do you think about the next question? Hiring a third party to provide on-site vaccination clinics. We already talked about this. You talked about this quite a bit, but as a quick recap, what type of liability, both in terms of personal injury for side effects from the vaccine or other types of employment-related liabilities could there be for if you bring in a third party? For instance, we know that Myers, for instance, right, is starting to work out contracts with employers when vaccines are available to provide on-site clinics for employers. So let's do a quick recap, Amy, for everyone on the phone on that.
Right. I think the first point to sort of keep in mind is that you have many sources of risk minimizing policies or immunities. As we talked about, your commercial general liability policy is going to ensure and provide the defense for any claims that might arise out of on-site vaccine clinics where an employee is harmed. You've got the potential for PrEP Act immunity that Tim mentioned, and that source of immunity may become stronger depending on whether you're able to enter into some sort of memorandum of understanding with the health department. Tim is a good authority on that. And so when we get to a point where we're thinking about on-site vaccine clinics, give Tim a call. He's thinking through these things. And then as we mentioned, you may have the opportunity to even put in your agreement with the third party some sort of indemnification clause. So you do have many sources of coverage or immunity in these scenarios where there's an on-site vaccine clinic.
Thank you, Amy. And remember, for on-site vaccination clinics, the folks that you're partnering with could arguably be considered your agents when they're asking your employees questions about their employees' health. So if you don't have a business necessity for requiring those vaccines, there could be an ADA issue as well. Let's move on now to Tim and HIPAA record keeping and confidentiality concerns. This has been kind of twisting folks up in knots thinking about these issues. And not to steal Tim's thunder, but I think, Tim, you're going to be focusing on employers who are not hospitals or healthcare entities themselves. But I'll let you take it away from here, and then we'll answer some questions.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. You're correct. Tomorrow I'll talk more in depth about for covered entities, healthcare providers, employers who are delivering medical services, and what their HIPAA obligations are, and balancing those with, the HR issues we discussed today, and we'll discuss some more tomorrow. But, for the majority of the people probably on today's call and, employers in general, this is really, I'm talking to you. So again, this is something we get questions on all the time. I think as COVID broke out, you would hear with the mask mandate issues, people showing up at grocery stores or restaurants and not without a mask, and then claiming HIPAA prohibited a grocery store from asking questions about, why they're not wearing a mask. And, Rebecca, you mentioned ADA and other issues. So, we do need to keep those in mind, but from a strict HIPAA perspective, HIPAA only applies to covered entities. So who is that? Health plans, which includes a self-funded company plan, a healthcare clearinghouse, which we probably don't have very many of those on the call today, and healthcare providers. So if you're a healthcare provider, please join me tomorrow where I'll talk a little bit more about this specifically for you. So again, most of you are not going to be covered entities. And just to be clear, you do not become a covered entity by requiring employees to be vaccinated. You do not become a covered entity by noting vaccination status in a personnel file. You do not become a covered entity by having an on-site vaccination clinic, barring some, rather unusual circumstances. Again, this is for non-healthcare providers. So this isn't to say you don't need to care about your employees' privacy, but HIPAA, for those who don't know, is very onerous. It includes much more than prohibitions on disclosing what's called protected health information. But most of you it's really difficult for you to become a covered entity unless you are one of those three type of entities above. So I think the one issue that will impact, people on the call are some of you will operate, have a self-funded health plans. So again, this is where you need to kind of keep a separation between the information for your health plans. So you're not going to share payment or other information related to vaccine or COVID testing with HR. And I should add that, this also applies to COVID testing as well. If you're having testing performed on at your building, at your site, that does not make you a covered entity. And again, obviously, for the providers on the line, you don't want to share medical records or other information with HR. We hear in the legal field, sometimes there's confidentiality issues. We have to keep a wall up in between, people. When we hire a new lawyer who might have worked at a different firm, sometimes we have to keep them separate, information separate. So that's what you're going to need to do if you're operating a health plan. It doesn't mean HR can't ask about vaccination status or can't keep a copy of someone's vaccination card in the personnel file just because you operate a health plan. The key here is to not have the health plan side of things provide information without authorization. One of the things to consider if you host a clinic is to work with a provider who's going to be administering those vaccines, and have the employee agree to authorize disclosure of that information, the fact that they've been vaccinated to their employer, and that would allow the healthcare provider who's doing the vaccinations to disclose that information to you. Alternatively, you hand your employees a HIPAA authorization that says that directs the provider or whoever's administering the vaccine to disclose that information to you. So how can HR find out if an employee has been vaccinated? You can ask the employee, or you can get an authorization, and you can do that, at the front end of things when, at the time of the clinic or after the fact. Again, even if you're not a covered entity, you should still treat that information confidentially. Obviously, you're not going to post a list of who has been vaccinated and who hasn't. That you still have some obligations to protect people's privacy. You don't do that with other HR records, and you wouldn't want to do that with vaccine status. One other thing I did want to mention, in addition to HIPAA, education entities, we're a long way from students being vaccinated. The two vaccines that have been approved for emergency use are all for 16 or 18 and above. So we're away from this, but for our, schools, we have school clients, school districts, especially our new Detroit office works a lot with schools. There are FERPA restrictions on disclosure of student records. So keep that in mind as well. I am not a FERPA expert, but I'd be happy to direct you to a colleague who is. So I think that covers most of those issues.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. We want to make sure that you are all aware of a free webinar that is happening tomorrow. It's not one of our own webinars, believe it or not. There are other organizations that have webinars on COVID topics. And this is one happening tomorrow that looks very, very interesting. And for those of you that are interested in hearing from the experts, right, on the safety and the side effects and those kinds of ins and outs of the vaccine, you'll find this very helpful. There's going to be one of the leaders from Pfizer. Obviously, Pfizer is one of the manufacturers of the vaccine, who will be speaking. There'll be someone from Myers there. Myers is rolling out a distribution to individuals as well as employer-sponsored clinics. So you may be interested in that. Go ahead. I'll just leave the screen up for a minute so you can take a screenshot and get that registration link that you can type in. Obviously, all of our slides are always, or our own webinars are available on our website later. If you don't catch it now, you can re-listen. Let's take a few of the questions. If we don't answer them live, you can email us after the webinar. Let's see. We had a few questions that are related, so I'm going to kind of mush them together. Once my employees are vaccinated, do they still have to work from home? Why don't the rules change, the safety rules change once my employees are vaccinated? Amy touched on this. I'll just touch on it one more time because it kind of defies common sense for some of us, so it's hard to accept. I think the scientific reason, to the extent there is one, is that they don't know yet whether the vaccine will prevent transmission, right? The research they've done on the vaccine shows that, my understanding of it at least, and obviously I'm not a scientist, is that folks who have been vaccinated are far less likely to suffer any effects of COVID-19, right? They won't get sick, basically. But the research hasn't been completed yet to determine if a vaccinated person can be a carrier of the vaccine. So even though I won't get sick from the vaccine because my immune system is strong enough because I got the vaccine, I may still be able to carry it and pass it on to people near me. And so that's why that is one reason maybe we haven't seen the laws change in terms of when you have to stay home and in terms of PPE that is required and keeping 6 feet of distance and that sort of thing. As we all say on every webinar, this could change any day, right? We may see some significant changes as the science develops with vaccines. Okay, let's just take a few more questions because we are running over. Amy and Tim, do you see any more questions that you would like to answer before we say goodbye?
Oh, one thing, there's a question about, like daily screening exams. Do daily screening exams, things like that need to be kept separate, even if not covered under a HIPAA? And so I would say the answer to that question is yes. The screening exams in particular, you're going to want to hang on and have those for, potential liability issues and also to show compliance with the various executive orders, or I guess at this point, the DHHS orders. But yeah, I would want to keep those separate from, from other records. Again, I think with respect to COVID, putting someone's vaccination card, proof of vaccination in their personnel file is fine.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so a few questions, they're all kind of related, so I'm going to lump them together and direct this question towards Amy. This will be our last question. If we're talking about workers' comp covering, then there must be some employer liability exposure, right? Another related question, if vaccines are so safe, why are so many employers and lawyers worried about liability? Why are we talking about this morning? So Amy, I'll let you answer those.
Sure. So I think it's pretty clear that when you're mandating the vaccine, regardless of where the employee gets vaccinated, some negative reaction will result in a workers' comp claim. And then, in terms of why are we thinking about liability? Well, I think our employers are always rightfully considering liability and considering the pros and cons of these important decisions. The goal is to keep their workplace safe, and there are always, there's always lingering this potential for harm caused to an employee, and we don't want that to happen. We certainly hope it does not happen, but it could happen, and it does affect employers' decision making. And so we think about these things on the front end with the hope that the harm never comes to fruition. But if it does, I think we've talked through the many ways in which employers are protected in this area, and importantly, the factors to consider when you're mandating versus imposing a voluntary policy, because there are lots of legal considerations, especially when you mandate.
I would just add that, in talking with clients about, any sort of risk, I think I tend to put things in, higher risk, medium risk, low risk, that kind of category. And I hope the conclusion you draw is that, this is a low risk possibility. Everything indicates that the vaccine is safe. There's a lot of information available from MDHHS to help address some concerns, either listeners or their employees might have. Again, you can listen to the webinar this afternoon that it's going to include, health departments, people from Meyer Pharmacy, Spectrum Health experts as well that might be able to address some of these questions. But even when something is low risk, we as lawyers always work and do our best to bring that even lower or to eliminate that risk completely. So I think that's why we focused on, some of these immunity provisions and discussed these liability issues, because even if, as Amy said, there's no duty here, or if it's a mandated, we have workers' comp where this is going to go. I think we always look to try and decrease that risk as much as we can. So I wouldn't read too much into our efforts to do that as an indication that the vaccine is not safe, but this is sort of our job as lawyers, for better or worse.
Well said.
Right. And well said, Tim and Amy. I'll just pile on and add that one of the reasons we're addressing this is a very common question we're getting from employers. One of the ways we decide what to talk about in webinars is when we start getting a lot of the same questions from a lot of employers. We know it's on people's minds, and we think this is an efficient and free way to get information to employers when they're all thinking about the same thing at the same time. And when clients ask us about liability, we're not the scientists, right? So really, it's not our job to tell you, the level of risk of harm to your employees and say that, trust me, I'm a lawyer, right? That's where the folks from Pfizer and from Myers and from the CDC and other experts, right? You should be listening to them about the level of risk. Tim is absolutely right. They all seem to be in agreement that the level of risk is very low. But that's where you go for that type of information. And then you come to us and say, I still think, in my own personal opinion, there is some risk. Tell me about whether my business could be liable if someone is harmed, and that's where we jump in to save the day. Okay, with that, we will let you go. As Tim mentioned, we have another webinar tomorrow focused on healthcare employers. They are doing their own vaccines, administering their own vaccines, so they have a whole host of issues that are unique to them, although you are all welcome to participate. And remember that vaccine webinar coming up January 28th at 1 p.m. With scientists who can help advise you on risk issues. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Stay healthy, and we hope to see you all soon.